You guys, so the bad news is our democracy is in horrible jeopardy. But the good news is I finally get to talk about the Spanish Civil War. So, yay! So let's respond to this comment. So this commenter is upset that I called Stalin a socialist. Why did I call Stalin a socialist? Well, it's natural and understandable that anybody who has any kind of sympathy towards the socialist cause, who has any socialist leanings, I count myself among those people. I generally think that socialism is the right way to go. Anybody who has that bent wants to put as much distance between socialism and Stalin as possible, because Stalin, newsflash, not a great guy. So back in this time period, though, in the 1920s and 30s, socialism was the global movement towards dismantling the capitalist state and returning the means of production to the workers. Socialism in its purest form is an economic movement. It wants to take the means of production out of the hands of billionaires, oligarchs, robber barons in this time period, and put that means of production back into the hands of the workers so that they benefit from their own work. Now, in a modern world, socialism has been equated more with the government owning the means of production and the government providing social services to the populace in return for their taxes. That's not pure socialism. Pure socialism is workers owning the means of production. Like, that's what it is. So that means if you work at a factory, you would own a share of that factory. That's the principle behind socialism. But it's the basis of a lot of these larger movements, like democratic socialism, which is what I just described, where the government owns the means of production and people get a lot of social services in return for their labor and their taxes. It also is the underpinning of communism, which is a philosophy that advocates for the violent overthrow of governments to impose socialism. So to act like communists weren't socialists is, I think, a whitewashing of history. It's ignoring the fact that the country that Stalin was in charge of was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The USSR, that's what it stands for. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So he was, at least in theory, a socialist. Now, he was technically a communist, which means he advocated for the violent overthrow and the top-down imposition of socialism. Now, was Stalin actually a socialist or a communist? No, he was a psychopath. He was a narcissistic psychopath. I'm sure he had the dark triad of personality disorders. Like, the dude was just an evil dude. And he saw an opportunity in the groundswell of popularity of socialism and communism to seize power. But he was not... I don't think he was a socialist. I don't think he was a communist. I think he was just an opportunist and a psychopath. But in this time period, Russia was seen as a bit of a shining light to socialists around the world. They saw it as a place where their dream of a utopian socialist country had come to fruition. Like, they had really high hopes for Russia. Like, Russia was aspirational in this time period because Stalin was keeping his misdeeds very tight and keeping the news of them from getting out. So he had a really tight control over media in his country, over what could get in and out in terms of information. So socialists in this time period would have seen and did see Stalin as a socialist, and they did see him as an ally, as a comrade in arms. So what happened when people did learn about Stalin's misdeeds. So let's first of all talk about what those misdeeds were. So Stalin is notorious for killing his political opponents, jailing and murdering them. He did this not just in Russia, he tracked them down in other countries. Trotsky being the most obvious example of this. He instituted farming and land reforms that caused the starvation deaths of tens of millions of people within Russia. These are his own citizens. These are people who presumably may have believed in socialism as a philosophy and an experiment, but they died of starvation because he imposed these top-down land and farming reforms that didn't work, and the harvest failed and people died. He also persecuted religious minorities like Jews in Russia. He persecuted ethnic minorities in Russia, like the Mongolians who were in Russia were persecuted under communism. And just a general real nasty police state, and just all around not a good guy. So people didn't find out about all of these war crimes and crimes against his own people and assassinations and the dark side of the Stalin regime until the 1950s. And that's when a lot of people internationally gave up on socialism because they had seen Stalin as an example of what could happen. This was the dream, and the reality of it came crashing down on them, and a lot of people were disillusioned and gave up on socialism. And socialism hasn't ever recovered in the United States. Now, part of what hurt socialism in the United States was, of course, the blacklisting under McCarthyism, that hurt socialism as well. But I would say that the main thing that hurt socialism in the United States was finding out the truth of Stalin. I think that even under McCarthyism, if people had felt like this philosophy was the way forward, if they'd had faith in it, if they could see some examples in the world of socialism working really well in the 1930s, if they hadn't seen like this disastrous human cost of communism and socialism in the USSR, I think that socialism would still be alive and thriving in the United States today. It was an alive and thriving movement in the United States in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. Like, it was, if you were a liberal-minded, progressive person, you were probably a socialist in that time period. And we then sort of tried to adopt some socialist policies under another name. It hasn't worked that well for us recently, so, I'm open to other ideas, but overall, I gotta say, just to respond to this commenter, I stand by Stalin being a socialist, because he would have called himself one, so...